Hi, and welcome back to the Avrum Rosensweig show. My name is Avrum Rosensweig, and I'm delighted to be here with you. This is the third show of my relaunch. You may have remembered Hat Radio. And there was also a preliminary, a young, a junior Avrum Rosensweig show, of which I did a few shows. But things sort of got halted at some point along the road. There are some challenges of doing podcasts, and I decided that it would be a good idea to take a little bit of a hiatus, work some things out, and come back and make it even better. And here we are. My first interview was with my niece, Devorah Mason, and after that was with Dr. Bradley Strauss. Both of those individuals have a strong affiliation with Israel. Devorah lives there. She's a mother of 5. She has a child in the army. And Bradley Strauss is a world-renowned cardiologist who decided it on October 7th or just thereafter that it was important for him to be in Israel. So he volunteered at a hospital there and he spoke about it. When you have a chance, have a listen, because in essence, what both of them were speaking of, and what I hope to accomplish this evening with my guest, my dear friend Eli Rubenstein, is to speak of the overall feeling in the air in Israel, how people are responding to October 7th and the days afterwards, the war in Gaza today. We're hearing a lot of stories coming out of Israel. Only a few are starting to trickle out about October 7th itself. But tonight, Ellie, who is a storyteller, will be sharing with us some really poignant and some very special stories about courage and bravery of many people in the southern part of Israel on that day, on that horrible day. I want to dedicate this podcast to the people of Israel, to the brave and courageous people of Israel of all backgrounds, to the IDF soldiers, Chayalim and Chayalot, of course, to those who are hostages, and we wish that they be released as soon as today and that they gain their freedom and that they are returned to their family. I also want to talk for a second about my Purpose and Meaning Roundtable, which is a sponsor of this show as well. Essentially, what I'm developing is a process or a program whereby families or companies or individuals even want to find their purpose and meaning in life. I will be more than happy to sit with them at a table and to help facilitate that, elicit from them their feelings and their thoughts about where they're at, what they once dreamed of. And if you would like to hear more of that, please feel free to contact me at my email, avrum.rosensweig@gmail.com. And if you'd like to see more about services that I offer, you can do so at avrumrosensweig.com. All right, let's dive in here. It is Chanukah, friends, and tonight is the fourth night, and I'm very honored to be with my dear friend Eli Rubenstein, who on very short notice agreed that he would be my guest this evening. We actually had um, Noah Braun lined up, who is the director and co-founder of the Israel Guide Dog Center for the Blind, of course, in Israel. And for technical reasons, we've had to postpone that, but we will be speaking with him, I'm hoping, within the next week. So, Eli, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you.
Remember what you said when you originally asked me to speak on the program. You said, Eli, you were here in my program a few years ago, Hat Radio. You did such a poor job. I'm willing to give you a second chance. I said, really? And then you admitted to me it was a scheduling conflict. So
yeah, it was amazing how many letters we got about the poor job you did.
And by the way, just behind me is your logo, which is actually covering up my Rembrandt. So I have a painting by Rembrandt, and now you have your logo on it. But I will tell you, Avrum is a great artist in his own right. He's a Rembrandt of our generation. So if you have a chance, check out Avrum's website for his incredible art, equal if not better than Rembrandt's.
Yeah, you're seeing a little bit of my narcissism, that my logo is covering up your Rembrandt. Yeah, I'm a proud narcissist, Eli. Eli is the director of education for March of the Living.
For International March of the Living.
International. He's also the spiritual leader at Congregation Habonim, and he's a renowned storyteller. I like to share with people that I once asked Eli, how many stories do you have in your head? How many do you remember? Most of us remember 2 or 3. Eli says, I remember about 2,000. And the next question I asked in part B of that was, how do you remember your stories? Ellie, how do you remember your stories?
Well, I remember my stories, I guess, in a couple of ways. One of the ways is when I'm hearing a story at the time and it sounds like a story that I'd like to retell, I
Yeah.
pay very, very close attention to the story and in my mind kind of create those connections, those little storyboards, if you will. And then once I've heard that story, I make sure to ask the person a couple of questions to fill in any blanks that I'm not sure about. And then once that's done, I make sure in the next few days to tell those stories over and over again. And once I've told it a number of times, basically becomes my story for the rest of my life. And I learned that the hard way because the first time I did storytelling in public, I hadn't done any of those methods. I'd heard a nice story some time ago, which I had liked, and then I didn't really pay that close attention to it. And then when the time came, someone asked me to come up to the stage and tell the story. I absolutely massacred the story because I didn't practice those methods. So ever out of adversity comes productivity. Ever since then, whenever I hear a story, I make sure to listen to it very carefully with sort of active listening, then make sure to get all the details. And then shortly thereafter, I tell it over a few times and then it becomes mine for the rest of my life. So that's a tip for all the listeners as well.
Is it okay to hear a story of a great Gaon, a righteous person from 300 years ago, and to change it?
Well, I guess there's a difference between mythology and history. When it's history, it's actual history, then it's not okay to change it because it's actual fact, and you should really be as loyal to the facts as possible. But so many of the stories in Judaism are folklore, and they've been passed from one generation to another generation to another generation to another generation, and naturally, consciously or unconsciously, the stories get changed. There's actually a very famous quote that says that every story has a beard, which means that people add to it. And sometimes we take stories that have elements to it that are hard to digest, and we just modify it in a way that people can digest it more. And so it's okay to take more like the folk tales, the parables, the tales that aren't necessarily historically true, but are morally true, and to make that more fitting for an audience of contemporary time. So I think it's okay when it comes to folk tales, yes.
Yeah, because I distinctly remember many times actually where you'll say, Avram, do you want to hear a story? I go, sure, that would be great. And you'll tell me the story, and then you'll go, oh, and do you want to hear my ending?
Yes.
Right.
And sometimes it's an improvement, sometimes.
If it's not history, if it's
Correct.
mythological in nature,
Correct.
right? Okay. Okay. Now, Ellie, you hold two very important positions. One is with March of the Living. One is with Congregation Habonim. Congregation Habonim is a non-denominational synagogue here in Toronto, a very popular one, and to some extent, I think it's appropriate to call it the Music Temple because of the fact that, be it Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, or Shabbat, whatever the holiday, whatever the service, there's always wonderful, wonderful music that's played in the background. You have some terrific, terrific musicians, and of course, Aviva Reisky, who is your chazanit,
And Rabbi
and Rabbi.
as well.
Yes. Oh, you're saying Aviva is a rabbi as well. Yes, yes.
Rabbi Cantor Reisky. And the reason they call it the music shul is because I don't sing, just to clarify.
Well, you have a nice voice.
Thank you for your kindness.
You do. You
Have
have
you
a lot.
have you seen a hearing specialist lately?
No, I have not actually. No. But you managed to sort of come upon a sort of a thematic approach to your shul, which really works, which people like a lot. And I would say not only is it the music, it's also the storytelling, it's the informality of your approach. You're not a rigid spiritual leader at all. Was that something that sort of grew organically, or did you just know all the time, if I'm to do this job, this is exactly how I want to do it?
Well, Lenny Bruce's famous quote. He says, millions and millions of people are leaving the church every day and finding God, right? And the point is, whether it's a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple, a lot of people stop leaving these places of worship because they fail to connect to where people are today. And so for me, the most important part of a synagogue service is to make sure people aren't bored, they're connected, they're feeling inspired and touched and moved and consoled or uplifted, depending on the circumstance. And I found very early on in my career, when I was doing my sermons at Habonim, when I'd be talking about Jewish philosophy or so Jewish ideas, people sometimes are listening, sometimes not, but you can hear like the chair is moving and people shifting in their seats. And as soon as I began to tell a story, stop. Everyone stopped. It was this, you could hear a pin drop, because what happens is when people hear stories, they say, oh, my life's a story too. And I found myself in that situation. And what would I have done? And what's that person going to do? What can I learn from it? And maybe I can share the story with somebody else. All of our lives are made up of story after story after story. And so I found that the easiest way and the most immediate way to connect with people is through storytelling. So I find the storytelling, the music, and the acceptability were very much a Y10 synagogue made it the thriving place that it is today.
Is Judaism conducive to storytelling?
Oh, I think it's at its core. There's a very famous quote. I first heard it from Eli Wiesel. I'm not sure if it's a midrash, but the quote he says was, "God created humanity because God loves stories. God created human beings because God loves stories, and the more diverse stories, the better." And in essence, what is the Torah? The Torah begins with the stories of creation, the stories of Adam and Eve, the stories of Noah and the flood, the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, the story of the Exodus. The Torah itself, at its essence, is definitely a book full of beautiful, inspiring stories to teach us for thousands of years. So yes, I think storytelling is an essential part of what Judaism is. And I grew up on stories.
Through the Talmud and otherwise, right?
And at my father's Shabbos table, my father was always telling stories. My mother loves telling stories. And yeah, that was always a real way that I connected to Judaism. And I find many people connect through that as well.
Do you remember a story your father told?
I remember my father used to read from the Midrash on Friday night in Chumash, but I do remember a story about my father, which I only learned at his shiva, which I always found very powerful. My father was very strict about people not talking during davening, during prayer. He's very strict about it.
He sure was.
And people like to talk sometimes in the synagogue, especially when it's the Leafs playoffs and they just lost a game the night before or something like that, right? And my father would often go over to people and object to them strenuously. And apparently one time he went too far and insulted somebody. And I learned at the Shiva, when my father passed away, that he got up the next week in synagogue, banged on the bima, banged on the podium, and said in public to the person who I embarrassed by telling too loudly to keep quiet, I ask forgiveness. And that was pretty brave and pretty courageous. So I always remembered that story from my father about someone told about my father about he in front of hundreds and hundreds of people asked forgiveness for something that he shouldn't have done.
Is that comfortable for a son to hear such humility from a father? Some might think not.
No, he grew in my eyes. It just showed me how seriously he took his Judaism and his religion. And a lot of my father had great respect for his father and great respect for the old life and the old country and the old world. And a lot of my Judaism is paying tribute to my ancestors who for thousands of years fought so hard to keep Judaism alive. And so, I don't necessarily agree with every single ritual, but my connection to ritual is my allegiance to the past. I think I told you a story about the Holocaust survivor who is a really, really interesting person. His name is Ernest Ehrman from Montreal. And, somebody asked him, how do you believe in, how do you believe in God after the Holocaust? And he's a religious Jew. He davens 3 times a day, wears a kippah, and he says, "Listen, I'll tell you, I had my struggles. I came back after the war, and my parents had been murdered, and I loved my parents so much. And so when I found out they were gone, I got so angry at God. I threw off my kippah, and I wasn't religious anymore after that. I ate rabbit meat, which I didn't even like, but I was so angry at God. And 6 months later, my parents came to me in a dream. My parents I loved and adored, and they said to me, this is the way we raised you, without any respect for our tradition, without any boundaries, without any principles. This is the son we raised." He said, "I felt so guilty. I became religious again and sent my kids to Jewish school and all that kind of stuff." And then the student said, "But what about God?" And he said, "I can't answer that." In other words, he still couldn't answer that question, but his Judaism was as much about theology as it was about his allegiance to his parents and his traditions to his ancestors. And whenever I tell the Jewish story, I feel I'm part of this chain of thousands of years of storytelling, which has enhanced people's lives and given them a moral compass through which to lead their lives.
Ellie, you and I both come from an Orthodox background. My father was an Orthodox rabbi. Your father, when he was young, was a yeshiva student, went to Talmudic school, and grew up as such until the day he left this earth. He was a God-fearing person, and he followed halacha, Jewish law, as your mother does. God bless her. She should be well. Now, you run a synagogue which is closest to Reform, although in essence it's non-denominational. But do you ever find that your father is sitting on your shoulder during your services, that you actually bring something, as you said before, from the old country, the place that he cherished so much?
Yes, I mean, I really feel the importance of that connection to thousands of years before us. I always remembered a friend of mine told me that the secret to Jewish continuity was when he went to synagogue every Shabbos, his father would take his tzitzis. This was Shalom Eisenstadt. Remember Shalom? His
Yes.
father would take his tzitzis and tickle his ear with the tzitzis, with the fringes from his prayer shawl. And I always found that story so touching. And so for me, when I'm in the synagogue, as much as I can, through the Hebrew liturgy, through the all Yiddish jokes, through the Jewish values, as much as I can connect people to our authentic Jewish past. Not that today is not authentic, but what we grew up on, I feel really that I'm making a difference. I feel there's a tension in Judaism between too much change and not enough change. If you change too much, you kind of lose that connection to our ancestors who came before us. If you change not enough, you also become in some ways not relevant and hard to connect to people. So there's a tension there. And I'm on the side of keeping as much tradition as possible, as long as it's positive and liberating and moving forward.
Eli, I once asked Yo-Yo Ma, who's a world-class celloist. I met him in a restaurant when
Did you say celloist or cellist?
cellist.
Cellist, okay.
You said celloist. I want to see if you were listening. Anyways, he said, I asked him when I said, Yo-Yo, I said, when is the best time to do a service? And he looked at me, he said, the best time to do a service is when I'm very, very tired, when I'm half asleep and half awake.
You mean a concert? You mean a concert, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yep.
So the best time to do a concert, I think I'm half awake, half asleep, is when I'm half awake and half asleep. And I said, why would that be? And he said, because it's then that my walls come down, and the real music from my soul is able to come out. And I thought about some of the services that you've done at Congregation Habonim, that they're late at night, and it's the end of Yom Kippur, and it's dark in the shul. The way your shul is set up is the lights come down, right? And of
Mm-hmm.
course, outside the sun has gone down, and there's this beautiful feeling in the shul itself, and there's a sense that the prayers that we're reciting are so powerful, and really make their way up into the heavens. Is there a time for you when a service feels even more powerful than other times?
Well, that time is certainly a sacred time when the sun is setting and you feel the gates of heaven are shutting. Every time you speak, you remind me of a story. And one of the most powerful stories I ever came across was about Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who was a very famous Hasidic Rebbe who lived 250 or so years ago, 200 years ago in Berdichev, which is now Ukraine. And in the story, according to his disciples, when the Elah came, the final prayer of Yom Kippur, he would fly up to the very heavens to intercede on behalf of God, on behalf of the Jewish people with God, excuse me. And one of the stories, he would sometimes be praying so hard that he would go a little bit after the end of the fast. In other words, the fast is over, let's say 8 o'clock. He would be up in heaven arguing with God, pleading with God until 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And one year he came back right at sunset, right at the stars came out, like no extension. Okay, the fast is over, go home and eat. And they asked him, what happened? He said, I was up in heaven and I was interceding with God. And I was on the verge of convincing God to bring the Messiah, to bring Mashiach, to redeem the Jewish people, all humanity, and all the world. And so what happened? I was about to get there. And I looked down on earth and I saw in the front row Moshe the water carrier with 10 children who was about to faint from hunger. And I was worried that he would not survive. What would happen to his family and his children? And I said to myself, I have no right to bring the Mashiach, the Messiah, on the shoulders of Moshe the water carrier. So I immediately flew down to earth, made an end to the fast, and saved Moshe the water carrier's life. Incredible story about the value of one single human life. No matter what cause you're looking at, there's nothing greater than the value of a single human life. So that's one of the stories that came to mind when you mentioned that moment.
It's a beautiful story.
Do you know the Baal Shem Tov story with the flute? Does that ring a bell?
When the little boy went into the shul and was playing the flute.
At Neela, yes. You want to tell that?
Right, and everybody was castigating him and his
Exactly.
father, and it was his father who turned to them. He said,
The Baal Shem Tov. It's the Baal Shem Tov.
Go ahead. You tell the story.
So basically, it's a little boy who was a shepherd who didn't speak Hebrew, didn't read Hebrew. All he did all year long was he used to herd his sheep and he used to play his flute. And his father used to drag him to synagogue every year for Yom Kippur. And of course, he didn't enjoy it because he didn't know what was going on. And by the end of the service, when Neela came, when the gates of heaven are closing, he is so despondent and so alienated and so estranged from what was going on. He can't take it anymore. He pulls out his flute and starts to play, which is the last thing you do at an Ela service in a Hasidic community 250, 300 years ago. And his father is looking at him with daggers in his eyes, and the service is over, and the Baal Shem Tov says, stop. We almost weren't forgiven this year. Do you know why? Because none of your prayers are reaching the heavenly throne, because they're all done out of rote, out of habit, just completely repetitious, not coming from any place deep inside your heart. But when that little boy played the flute, it came right from his heart and went right up to the heavenly throne. And on his behalf, we've been forgiven. Prayers are not the words you say, it's the meaning behind it, that they come from the heart. And prayers that come from the heart enter the heart. So that's a beautiful Hasidic story, again, about meaning and prayer and Judaism and connecting to God.
And I'll add to that when my sister Chavi lost her husband, she found it very hard to pray. And of course, that bothered her a lot because she's very religious, has a lot of faith in God, but the words didn't come out. So someone very wise said to her, do you cry? And she said, of course I cry. And they said to her, well, tears are prayers as well.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, absolutely beautiful. Tears are prayers. And the Kotzker Rebbe says there's nothing as whole as a broken heart.
Yeah. So sometimes when I lead a service, and very often I do so at Habonim, and I'm also grateful. I'm always grateful when you offer me that opportunity because I love Habonim very much. I'll begin with that story because there are an awful lot of people who do not have the ability to open a siddur, certainly read the Hebrew, and even if they read the English, they find it very almost archaic. So tears can be prayers as well, and even playing a little flute. Those sounds can reach God. Of course they can. Now, let's segue that into October 7th. On October 7th, which was the holiday of Shmini Atzeret here in Toronto, Simchat Torah in Israel, there was an incursion by Hamas terrorists into the southern part of Israel. We all know about that today. And that day or that incursion has been described by many as a pogrom. And I think that's an appropriate definition. I did a service that morning at Shul at Habonim. And I remember calling you and saying, do you have any words for me, words of strength or inspiration? And you said to me, about what? Because it was very early in the morning and you hadn't heard about October 7th yet. And I explained to you about what happened. And then, of course, shortly afterwards, you went and you watched the news and you brought yourself up to snuff as to the occurrences there. And I stood in front of the shul, in front of the congregation, and I was so taken by what had happened and it was so fresh in my mind that I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to speak or not. And I was very quiet. I couldn't muster up that voice that I generally have, more of a barreling voice coming from my chest. I felt very, very subdued. But I also remember thinking to myself, you know what? I see myself as a Jewish leader, and it's really important that I give people here strength. And I do so by showing my own strength. So that's what I did. And then, of course, we all went home afterwards, and everyone was fixated on CNN and other media outlets, and the horrible news started to come in. What we're finding out now, and over the last few weeks, is that while awful things happened to our Israeli brothers and sisters, we also know that there was tremendous amount of courage and bravery that occurred on that day within southern Israel. A lot, and we're hearing more and more about those stories. I know that you have some stories to share with us this evening about such courage, about such bravery. Let's open up with one and hear some of your stories.
Yes. So, of course, that morning we still didn't even know the extent of the tragedy because the initial numbers were a few hundred, then it was 600 and 800. And I think the final number they have is approximately 1,200 people who were murdered, never mind the people that were injured as well. So, yes, there's a number of incredibly moving, uplifting stories of heroism and courage and sacrifice. I read about this Bedouin bus driver, the name of Yosef Ziadna, who saved like between 30 and 40 people who were at the dance festival. And when he was going, he saved a couple of Jewish people, and then he brought them to safety. And then he goes back and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm going to save more people." And there are bullets flying over his head. And he said, I couldn't leave them behind. My conscience wouldn't allow me to do that. And he said what he saw, he will never forget the rest of his life. The carnage, the incredible amount of people who were lying dead on the roads. He'll never, ever, ever forget that for the rest of his life. But he saved between 30 and 40 people, this Bedouin bus driver from the city of Rachav. And also from the same Bedouin town of Rachav, there were 4 Bedouin men who had a cousin, Hisham, who's called the town and said, please come rescue me. And he was hiding with a woman named Aya Meidan from Kibbutz Be'eri, and they were kind of hiding together. And these 4 Bedouin came and rescued them. And again, on the way, they rescued 30 other people, risking their lives to save them. And when the Israeli soldiers finally caught up with Aya and Hisham, they thought that these were terrorists, and they were about to shoot. And they said, no, please, we're Israeli, don't shoot us. And then Aya said, no, we weren't. I wasn't kidnapped. These 4 men saved my life. She was taken to the police station of Hakim, which they were put on. She was put on a bus to Beersheba. And these 4 Bedouin were so worried about her, they called her on the cell phone. They said to her, look out the window. She looked out the window. We're following you all the way to Beersheba to make sure you're completely safe. So those are some beautiful stories about Israeli Bedouins who saved lives. And there's a story about this Filipino caregiver.
Before you go on with another story, would you say that the motivation that righteous Gentiles had during the Holocaust to save Jews at the peril of their own lives and of their children would be the same motivation that this Bedouin person had, or Jews saving Jews? Like, not everybody can do that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that person who's raised with the value that a human life is a human life, and that that these people deserve to be protected, even at the risk of your own life, is righteous among the nations during the Holocaust, Arab Bedouin saving Jews during the October 7th massacre, and Pharaoh's daughter risking her life to save Moses in the Nile River some 3,500 years ago. So yes, I believe there's a through line between all those acts of piety and goodness and kindness. And Judaism teaches us that there's goodness in all people, or the potential for goodness. So it's consistent with our philosophy.
What I heard once was that righteous Gentiles were asked through the study that was done, what was it that motivated you to save a life, again, at the risk to your own family, to yourself? And the response pretty much across the board was that when we were younger, our parents taught us to be empathetic, so that when we were walking along the road and we would see a poor person sitting by the side of the road, our parents would instruct us to go over them and ask them per their welfare, to look in their eyes, to kneel down, and to say, how are you? Is there something I could do for you? Do you think there is something to that?
Yes, I've read many stories of righteous among the nations, and not all of them, but many of them talk about the education they were raised with, how they were taught to respect all human beings and to love humanity. And certainly the apple doesn't fall from the tree, far from the tree in many of those cases. So yes, I would say that would be consistent with a lot of the stories that I've read.
Tell us the Filipino story.
So there's a Filipino caregiver. She's 31 years of age. Her name is Camille Shasalva. And she was taking care of a 95-year-old woman named Anitza Chefetz in Kibbutz Nerim. And of course, the attack starts, and she is hiding in a cupboard with her, and she's so convinced she's going to die. She calls her mother in the Philippines, says, please, just show me the picture of my 6-year-old son, so that'll be the last thing I see before I die. And finally, the terrorist breaks in, and she, spur of the moment, decides to give him all the money she had saved up for the trip to the Philippines. She's supposed to leave in a couple of days. I think it was something like 1,500 shekels. He took the money and he let them go. And unbelievable moment of just courage to do that. And the family is so grateful. And she was supposed to go to the Philippines a few days later. And she stayed for many, many weeks afterwards to make sure her employer, Nitza Chefetz, this 95-year-old woman, was okay. And then there's incredible stories of Israeli heroism. There's a woman by the name of Adina Moshe from Kibbutz Nir Oz, who was 72 years of age. And when she was told she was released, she said, don't take me. Take this other woman. She's older and in much worse condition than me. I mean, she just was willing to sacrifice her life for another woman. I think of children like Emily Hand, who, when she was in captivity, they asked her when she came out, she said, I was in captivity for a year. That's how long she felt it was. And the only word she learned in captivity in Arabic was be quiet, because that's what they kept telling her to do. And many other children, some of them who refuse to eat because they're afraid they're eating too much and will deprive other people from their food. And the incredible torture, and psychological and physical, the beatings they endured. Their captors told them, no one cares about you anymore. They've left you behind. You'll never see them again. So I think of those children, their heroism and their resilience. I think of 22-year-old soldier by the name of Aner Eliakim Shapiro. And he was in a bunker with a number of other Israelis. And what happens is the Hamas, and I send the video, they start throwing in grenade after grenade after grenade. 1, 2, 3 people are just going by and throwing a grenade, just trying to blow these people up. Just people from a dance festival, just trying to blow them up. And he, Aner Eliakim Shapiro, 7 times in a row, picked up the grenade. You don't see him, but he throws it out. Unfortunately, the 8th time, he didn't succeed to get it out before it detonated. He lost his life, but he saved a number of other people, at least 7 people's lives he saved. And what's so moving to me was his mother said after the story was released to the media, she said, I'm going to quote, "What brings me comfort is that he saved so many people and gave them life. We won't get to see our son have children, but we were privileged to see those whom he saved, who they will go on to have children and will live good and happy lives." And she said, I'm filled with love for these people that I saved without even knowing them. So that's another beautiful story. There's our good friend, Dennis Klein's son, Dennis and Gabrielle Klein in Israel. His son, Shlomo Klein, who just visited me last summer at my cottage. He was on the border of Gaza and was the first outpost that was attacked. He was with a unit called Severyn Nahal. As soon as they were attacked, he jumped onto a car with a machine gun and he held off the Hamas forces for enough time to let his fellow soldiers get back inside. And then once he was inside, they were outnumbered and outmanned and outgunned completely. They held off Hamas for about 6 hours. In the process, one of his good friends next to him was shot and killed on the spot. And he realized that Hamas has this terrible, terrible tactic of not only kidnapping live Israelis, but kidnapping dead Israelis. And he was worried they would grab his friend and use it as part of like a hostage thing, as to get more prisoners out of jail in Israel. And so he tried to grab his friend to hide him from Hamas, and he was shot in the arm. And even though he was shot in the arm, for the rest of the day, he helped organize another rescue mission with helicopters to help his friends get back to the hospital. So that Shlomo Klein is now convalescing and trying to get the usage of his arm back again. And
Ellie, before you go on, there's a story about an elderly woman who a terrorist entered her home.
Yes.
And her husband, and she offered them food to eat. I believe she was a Moroccan, a Sephardic Jew. You want to tell? Do you know the story?
Well, yeah, she basically offered them tea and cookies and basically made them sort of so comfortable that by the time the Israeli soldiers came, they were able to rescue her and kill the terrorists. And I think Israelis have this incredible sense of humor. If you go in that area, there's an Uber Eats thing. Here's a good place to get coffee and cake.
Right, that's right. So my question to you is, I know that there's humor that came out of the Holocaust, and certainly there's humor that's coming out of Israel. It's a funny country in that way. Is that okay?
Yes, we cope in many different ways. I saw an Israeli humorist that said that during the blackout in Hamas, when there was no internet connection, there was a person from the Gaza Strip called tech support and said, "Please, my internet is down. What can I do?" And the tech support person said, "Have you tried releasing the hostages?" So yes, I think humor is one of the ways that we deal with tragedy, and certainly it's something that we saw even during the Holocaust, where Jews would use humor. I remember a Holocaust survivor told me a story about. This is the joke they used to tell in the camps, that Hitler's astrologers were approached by Hitler, and Hitler says, "When am I going to die?" The astrologers come back, "We don't know the exact date, but you're going to die on a Jewish holiday." And Hitler says, "Which Jewish holiday?" And the astrologers say, "We're not sure which one, but any day you die will be a Jewish holiday or a holiday for the."
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right.
So I want to also share with you the story of Rimon Kirscht, who was captured by Hamas with her husband Yagev. And when the time came for her to be released, she said, "I'm not going without my husband. You have either take both of us or none of us. If you don't go, we're going to drag you across the floor." Unfortunately, they took her. But when she was released, she looked the Hamas terrorist right in the eye. She hugged her fellow captive Meral and just walked proudly. Didn't even placate Hamas or Red Cross with a fake smile. She just marched strong and proud. So that's an example of incredible bravery. And then I want one other final story about October 7th, which I found just a tiny moment, but it was a moment that was very telling. It was with Anderson Cooper. He was interviewing a woman who had lost a number of family members and friends. And Anderson Cooper said to her, "So what are you going to do?" And she said, "I'm just going to practice more acts of loving kindness." And Anderson Cooper says, "More acts of loving kindness? Well, what's that going to do? Like, how's that going to solve the problem?" And she said, "What else can I do? What else should I do? I'm just going to go practicing acts of loving kindness." And it was just a beautiful moment where she was telling Anderson Cooper, "I don't know what the ultimate answer is, but I'm not going to answer him with more hate. I'm not going to answer darkness with more darkness. I'm going to bring more light to the world. And there's so many incredible acts of kindness, and not just during October 7th. The entire Israeli society, right, left, secular, Orthodox, has come together, helping each other, chipping in through all sorts of acts of charity and communal activities. And I remember a Hasidic master once said the following, people talk about miracles in times of war, and there's people talking about miracles during October 7th. You know what he said? There is no greater miracle than the miracle of human kindness. And I've seen the Jewish world come together in Israel and all around the world, helping out in so many different ways with NGOs and charities and organizations like Hatzalah and Zaka. I'm sure you're familiar with both of them, who do such exceptional altruistic work. And so in this terrible tragedy, the Jewish people have come together, and their allies, and we have allies supporting us as well. And those are moments of light we should recognize too. And I think, like in the Chanukah stories that we've told from thousands of years from now, people will talk about the heroism and the courage that people showed on October 7th in the face of just abject terror.
By the way, Zaka is the organization that will go in after a terrorist attack and really clean up the situation, right? It's a very harrowing, a very challenging job.
And give people a dignified burial.
Very much so. And Hatzalah is essentially a religious ambulance service. They have them here in Toronto as well. I've actually used them after a heart attack. Eli, having been working with March of the Living for so many years, and now the director of international education, so much of March of the Living is teaching the young people about obviously what happened during the Holocaust and taking them to those environments so that they literally walk on the tracks leading up to Auschwitz. Having seen what happened on October 7th and the subsequent response of the Jewish world, what we call Achdut, the unity coming together, can you see or have you seen many March of the Living participants become involved in helping out the Jewish people at this time because of the program, because of what the organization has taught them?
Yes, I've definitely seen incredible activity online and people understanding that, what they saw, in their education on the March of the Living was the Holocaust didn't happen overnight. It began with quotas in universities, with anti-Semitism on the streets, with people boycotting Jewish businesses. And so they're very, very active in standing up for Israel and Jewish people. And it's very heartwarming to see that. I do want to say something else about this whole situation. I am heartbroken for the loss of Israeli life in this war, the 1,200 innocent men, women, and children who've been murdered so heartlessly. But I'm also heartbroken for the people of Gaza, for the Gaza Strip. And as a friend of mine once said, it's possibly heartbroken for two people at the same time. And I'm reminded of a beautiful story from Golda Meir, who tells a story about a father and son who were in the near the Jordan River before the '67 war, and they're being shelled upon mercilessly. And the father and the son go into a bunker, and they're hiding in the bunker. And the son's really scared because he's hearing these missiles going overhead. And the father says, "Oh, don't worry. Those missiles are not coming from the other side anymore. It's us responding. So we're now firing back. So those missiles aren't going to hit us." And the little boy says, "Oh, so those missiles are going into Jordan and they're attacking Fatah?" He says, "Yes." And the little boy says to his father, "But what about the little children in Jordan? Do they have bunkers they can hide in? Because it's not their fault that Fatah is firing upon us. It's not their fault. Do they have bunkers that are protecting them as well?" And that was a beautiful story about this little child saying, I care about my safety, but I care about the safety of others. And unfortunately, as you know, Hamas, when they took over Gaza Strip, did not build bunkers for their people. They built, tunnels to smuggle arms. They built arms factories. And so it's really tragic what's going on, the loss of life in the Gaza Strip. And I hope that as soon as Israel defeats Hamas, that they'll get peace and they'll be able to resume their lives. It's heartbreaking. We all know that October 7th was a war launched by Hamas on Israel, and Israel needs to take defensive steps. They're not going to survive if they don't take care of this. But it's heartbreaking. We all have the famous story about Jacob and Esau, when Jacob comes to meet Esau, and he's afraid that the text says Jacob was both afraid and terrified. You know this midrash, of course, Avrum. And why was Jacob afraid and terrified? He was afraid he'd be killed, but he was terrified also that he might have to kill, even though it was self-defense and he had no choice, and he was allowed to, but it was still a terrible thing to have to do. So it's heartbreaking. And I certainly hope that as soon as that there's a little loss of life among the innocent civilian Palestinian population, until the war is finished. And I hope you share those sentiments.
How much empathy should one have for their enemy?
Okay, so just the enemy is not, innocent civilians and children who are losing their lives in the Gaza Strip.
For their adversaries, let's say.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. There's a very famous thing in Pirkei Avot, and I'll also quote Yitz Greenberg, who says something along the same lines. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? In other words, you cannot rely on the world to take care of you. We've seen what happens with that. The Jewish people have to take care of themselves, because if we don't, nobody else will. History has taught us that too many times. But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And so once we've taken care of our own self-preservation, once we make sure that we can survive, that's not good enough. We have to reach out and try to help other people thrive as well. And so there's a real delicate balance between self-preservation, but also at the same time, understanding other people have needs to and have to deserve to live. And Yitzhak Greenberg says of Olav Shalom, he said that if the Israeli army is a moral army, he says, but it could be a bit more moral. So let's say they're 5% more moral. Great. But if they're 10% more moral, they won't be an army anymore. They'll be destroyed. So it's a very delicate balance between standing up for yourself, but also having compassion for the people who are unfortunately their leaders are causing this terrible tragedy to happen.
Eli, I found since October 7th that the many members of our community are very scared about the rise in anti-Semitism. They're very uncomfortable with it. Of course, we all know stories about individuals who will not wear their Magen David out. They will not wear a kippah publicly. I was in shul yesterday. It was my mother's yortzeit, and an individual spoke, gave a Dvar Torah, and he's a frum guy, and he says he no longer wears his kippah outwardly on the subway. He wears a hat. Similarly, there are people who have taken down their mezuzah. Now, on the flip side, I've also seen people put up flags on their house, Israeli flags. So it does go both ways. But what I'm curious about, I think what people would like to hear is when you have community members call you or speak to you about their fear, about the rise of anti-Semitism and the unsuredness of our footing as it used to be as Jews in Canada and around the world, and of course because of what's going on in Israel. What's your response to them? How do you comfort them?
So there are three responses to people's fears about anti-Semitism, especially those people are children of survivors who are especially traumatized by what they're seeing today in the world. The first difference between now and the Holocaust is that we have a state of Israel. Okay, so that's number one. There's a state of Israel which can defend Israel and indeed the entire Jewish people. That's the first answer. The second answer is that we have allies. If you look at President Biden, how quickly he rose to Israel's defense, and many other countries around the world. Some were disappointed in, but there are still many allies in the Western world who are defending Israel's right to defend herself.
Japan is an interesting example.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
And thirdly, the Jewish community is very strong. We're mobilized. Yuda Bauer once said, the only thing the Jews were guilty of during the Holocaust was failing to imagine the unimaginable. Failing to imagine the unimaginable. We now have learned that lesson. We know that what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust is no longer unimaginable. So we're standing tall, we're standing proud, we're demonstrating, we're activating, our political connections. We're doing our best to demonstrate. So I feel that we're in a much better shape than we were before the Holocaust, when anecdotally this famous story about this German citizen who's Jewish, who's deported to the camps. He arrives to the train station with her medals from World War I, saying, I'm a hero, you can't deport me. And of course, he was murdered in the Holocaust like many other people. That naivete the Jewish community no longer has. So I think those three factors, having the state of Israel, having actual allies, who stand up for us like United States and other countries, and also the fact that we are a powerful, very, very outspoken Jewish community with resources and experience and professionals who are taking a stand. I think those three factors put us in a better situation.
Ellie, one of the things that I love that you've done throughout your career is March of Remembrance and Hope together with your colleagues. And essentially what that is, it's like March of the Living, but instead of taking Jews to Poland and Israel, you take non-Jews. And I know some of your groups, one of your groups included Native Canadians. And do you have any stories to tell, or any evidence, let's say, that those have been effective in terms of what's happening now?
Well, I've had a number of students on the trip reach out to me and just say, "How are you doing? I'm
Yeah.
thinking these difficult times." And I was also very moved when that rally for the Jewish people in Ottawa, there was a representative of the First Nations community got up and said that the Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel, right? Because that's something that gets very lost in the media. I mean, there was a very famous meme going around the internet that when the explorers came to North America in the 15 and 1600s, you know what? When they were digging in archaeological ruins, they didn't find a copy of Shakespeare. They didn't find a copy of the Magna Carta. Do you know why? Because they were not indigenous to North America. These explorers, the Europeans and the French and the British, they were not indigenous to North America. But when we Jews came back to the land of Israel, we do archaeological digs. What do we find? We find mikvahs and ancient coins and hieroglyphics and carvings and pottery, all reflecting the fact that Jews lived there thousands of years ago. So, there are other indigenous groups in the land of Israel, and I'm not claiming there aren't, but certainly the Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel. And I was so gratified when that First Nations person stood up at the rally in Ottawa and said the Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel. So that's a very important point that we make.
What is your response to people who say the Jewish people are alone in the world? We don't have people who are caring about us, thinking about us, want to help us.
Well, as I just said, we've had many allies in the world, many political leaders and many grassroots people who are reaching out all over the place and expressing solidarity for us. So, unfortunately, we have no shortage of enemies as well, but we shouldn't close our eyes to the many people of good faith who are trying to rise to help us at this time.
So, as I mentioned before, this is the fourth night of Chanukah. Chanukah is always it's considered to be a minor holiday, but in our family, it's not so minor because my mother passed away on the second night of Hanukkah. So as I mentioned as well, we just went through her yard site, and she's been gone for 8 years. And you kind of make that correlation between the lights or the holiday itself, and in our case, the passing of our mother. And there's a lot of beautiful things you can say that her neshama, her soul, continues to illuminate the world that we live in. I wonder if you can sort of verbally light the fifth night of Hanukkah candle for us by telling us a story or two about the holiday.
Are we at the fifth night or the fourth night?
Is it the? It could be the.
I think it's the fourth.
I'm a little tired. I still have to take my son to hockey, so I'm trying to keep my energy up.
I think it's four.
Is it the fourth night?
Right?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think you're right. It's the fourth night. Yeah.
Never good at math, right? Yeah,
Well,
I've got a couple of.
Light the fourth night candle for us verbally.
I think I've got three very beautiful Hanukkah stories that I want to conclude with, if that's okay with you. And they're all quite short.
Yeah, please.
The first Hanukkah story is called The Secret Gift. And this story almost didn't come to light. And it only came to light because the grandson of the person who's in the story discovered a whole batch of letters a number of years ago. And in the story, it's 1933 in Canton, Ohio. It's the height of the American Depression. And people were so poor, they would actually go to the railroad tracks. And when some of the trains were going by burning coal, they would actually manage to find some of the coal and use that to heat their homes. People were struggling. People would purposely get arrested. You know why? Because at least in jail, they get 3 square meals a day. It was a terrible, terrible time. And in early December, I believe it was the sixth night of Hanukkah, an ad appears in the Canton Expositor, which is a newspaper. And it says the fact that I know a lot of people are suffering. A lot of people don't have to make ends meet. I've been very successful, and I'm so blessed by God to be so successful. I want to share some of my bounty with the first 75 people who send me a postcard. I will give you $5, just as long as you explain to me why you need it. And I guarantee your anonymity. Nobody will ever find out that you needed this. I'll never share your names with anybody, right? And the letter was signed Beaver Dot in the newspaper, right? And so what happened was, not 75 letters, 150 letters came in, and they were heartbreaking. One woman couldn't afford to pay the funeral home for burying her husband. Another person hadn't given her child a square meal in months. one letter after another, people in terrible, and all of them were pleased, mortified if anybody ever find out that I took help, because people were very proud. And so Beaver Dot, whoever that was, ended up not helping 75 people, but 150 people with $5. And $5 back then is like $100, $150 today. So it was a huge sum of money, right? But here's the problem with that story. If you go into the births and death records or any kind of records in Canton, Ohio, you'll not find a person by the name of Beaver Dot. That name doesn't exist. Do you want to know why? Because it was a fake name. Whoever did this didn't want people to know. He not only did not want people to know who was receiving the money, as Maimonides tells us, the highest form of charity is where you don't tell people you're giving the money either. So no one knew who he was, right? No one knew that the name of Beaver Dot, because it was obviously a pseudonym. We only found out, I think, about 10 or 15 years ago when his grandson, a reporter for the Washington Post, Ted Gupp, found a suitcase with all these postcards. And it turns out it was his grandfather who was helping all these people. Who was his grandfather? His name was Samuel Stone, but his original name was Samuel Finkelstein. He was born in Romania. He fled the pogroms. His only language until 16 was Yiddish. He had kept a kosher home. He was quite religious. He made and lost a fortune, but then he was doing quite well. And he was the person who looked out his window in December, early December of 1933, when it was Chanukah for the Jews, but not Christmas yet. And he said to himself, how can I celebrate Hanukkah and my neighbors can't celebrate Christmas? How can I enjoy my holiday when my Christian neighbors can't enjoy theirs? That's not fair. And he was the guy that gave a family their first square meal months, a boy his first baseball glove, a girl her first doll, another child her first rocking horse. He was the person who said, when I'm lighting my Hanukkah candle, it can't just be for me. This light has to spread out and warm the entire world. So that's my first beautiful Hanukkah story. It's called The Secret Gift by Ted Gupp, about this amazing story about a person who understood that to be Jewish means not just to care about yourself, but to care for all humanity. So that's the first story. The second story comes from my friend Carla Wittes, daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I believe her mother was on the Kindertransport, if I'm not mistaken. And this story also has to do with the Kindertransport. And why that's so important was because this past week was the 85th anniversary of the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was a rescue of 15,000 Jewish children, 10,000 who ended up in England. Before it started at the end of 38, December of 38, and went until the outbreak of World War II. And these children were put on trains by their parents. Many of them never saw their parents again, but they were rescued and adopted by families in England and other countries as well. So one of those people I want to tell you about his name is Tommy Berman. Tommy Berman came from a town called Chronov, Czechoslovakia. And the way that Carla Wittes tells the story, because she recorded the story, was that he was on the Kindertransport, ended up in Israel, became a scientist, and near the Kinneret, near the Galilee, and never saw his family again. And he kept wanting to return to his family home. And so what happens is his wife says, so why don't you go already? So he goes back to Chronov, Czechoslovakia. And he comes back to the place where he grew up, and whoever had moved into that house really liked the architecture of the pre-war period. So they actually restored the house to the way it looked like before the war. So not only was he returning to his home, but he returned to a home that looked exactly the way it was when he was a child. So it was quite moving for him. He knocks on the door, they answer the door, and he says to them who he is. So please come in. You used to live here. We honor to have you as a guest. What would you like to do? I'd like to go to my bedroom. So he goes up to his bedroom, and on the way, you know what he sees? Everywhere he goes is crucifixes, because this is a very, very religious Catholic couple, which is fine. Crucifixes everywhere. He goes into his bedroom. He sits on his bed. And then he felt he was like a 9-year-old boy again, waiting for his parents to tuck him into bed and read him a bedtime story. And then he comes down the stairs. And then all of a sudden, he looks into the living room and he sees something over the mantelpiece. And he's shocked. You know what he sees over the mantelpiece? Want to guess?
A menorah.
A menorah. A beautiful silver menorah. And he loses his breath. And the people say, oh, sorry, we forgot to mention this to you. When we moved into the house, we renovated the house from top to bottom. In the basement, we found the chest with this beautiful, beautiful Jewish menorah. And so we honor the Jewish people and we respect them. We wanted to honor them with the presence of this menorah. So we have it here as a symbol of the people who used to live here. But obviously this belonged to your parents. So please take it. He looks at the people. He looks back at the menorah over the fireplace on the mantelpiece and he says, no, leave the menorah exactly where it is. It's home. It's where it belongs. Isn't that a beautiful story?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So, and I'm not sure why he did that, but my guess is that the entire Jewish life was destroyed there. Let this house at least have a little bit of remembrance, a little bit of sign that Jews once lived here. So that story by Carla Witt is called The Last Menorah of Chronov. And my
Eli,
final, go
yeah,
ahead.
please go ahead. Yes,
Did you want to ask a question?
I do, but it's appropriate at the end of the story
Yeah.
as well.
Okay. And the last story I just came across a couple of days ago was shared by the USC Shoah Foundation. This is a foundation in California that has collected over 50,000 Holocaust survivor testimonies and testimonies of survivors of other genocides. And in fact, is collecting testimonies right now from people who survived the October 7th massacre. So they're doing incredibly important work. It was
And
founded
by
as,
the way, did you hear that Spielberg is creating some sort of documentary around October 7th?
I did not know that, but his organization is collecting these stories, so it would make
Yeah.
sense. An incredible work. This all came from Schindler's List. When he made Schindler's List, a number of survivors came up and said, what about our stories? And that's what prompted him to create this exceptional archive of stories. It'll be valuable for generations, centuries to come, the work he's done with the archive. So this is the story of Annette Basla Finger, who was 11 years old when she fled Paris during the Holocaust and eventually ended up in the Pyrenees. And during her journey, she finds herself hiding in a barn on Chanukah. And there's a cow that she's nuzzling up the cow to keep warm. And she becomes depressed and she looks at her father and says, look, it's Hanukkah. We can't celebrate anything. We have nothing to celebrate. We have no menorah. We have no candles. We have nothing. And she's really upset. And his father says to her, you're wrong. Come with me. He opens the crack of the barn. He says, look out into the sky. In the countryside, there's no like artificial light. So the stars are incredibly bright. He says, look up into the sky. See if you can find a shamas. She says, okay, I found the shamas. Now choose 4 stars to the left and 4 stars to the right.
Very good.
That is your Hanukkah menorah. And she said that moment was so beautiful. She felt so close to heaven and so close to God. And she said it was the most joyous Hanukkah she ever had. And so I think of that story and all the other stories we shared today about the people in October 7th that form.
It looks like we lost Ellie. We'll try to bring him back. Hold on one second. Ellie, are you there with us?
I am. Can you see me?
Yeah, we're okay now. Just pick up on what you were about to say. It reminds you of October 7th, that story about the stars in the sky. You still there?
1 second.
Making some adjustments. You know that we're live, right?
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so where I was just at the end of that story, and I was saying that these stories that I shared with you about October 7th and Hanukkah were shaped and formed during the most trying moments of the Jewish people, during the most trying times of the Jewish people. And I hope they serve to inspire hope and courage in our hearts for many years to come.
I remember when we were at your cottage on Christian Island. I was maybe one of the first times that I was there, and you said to me it was very late at night and it was dark outside. You said, "Come outside with me on the deck." I said, "Okay." And then subsequently, what you did was you shut all the lights in the cottage, and you said, "Lie down on one of the chairs," and you said, "Now look up at the sky," and and it was magnificent as you just explained. Um, and now I understand why that was so important to you. Did you think of that story? Would you have would you have seen the lights of Hanukkah possibly in the stars and the shamas?
I not at the time, but now, of course, when I think back on it, yes. But there's a beautiful poem by Chana Senesh. Are you familiar with it?
Yes. Oh, the poem? No, but Hannah Senesh, yes.
Um, it's a poem that I don't remember it off by heart, but she talks about her looking up at the she talks about looking up at the sky.
I guess we are still trying to get the wrinkles out because we've lost Ellie again. Not sure if we're going to get him back this time, but it has been an hour show and it's gone quite quickly. At least for me. I wonder if it has for you. So perhaps what we should do is wrap up. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening to the show. I think Eli's been magnificent. He's a wonderful storyteller and a great human being. And once again, when you have a chance, take a look at avrumrosensweig.com if you'd like to know more about some of the services that I offer. And I really truly look forward to being back with you again when we will be with Noah Braun, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Israel Guide Dogs for the Blind. I think we have Eli back, so perhaps he wants to say goodnight to us.
Yeah, sorry about that. There's a poem by Chana Senesh that goes something along these lines. You could actually pull it up later. She says that, there are stars that we're looking at that are visible to the human eye, but they're no longer there. Okay, in other words, we're seeing their light from they're around millions of years ago, and there are people who are like stars who are no longer with us. They light the way for humanity, and so we have all these stories of people who came before us who are no longer with us, but they inspire us and they guide us and they light the way for us. So that's what I think when we talk about stars.
That's lovely, Eli. Thank you so much. I was just saying that I thank very people for coming. I thought you did a magnificent job. I love your storytelling. And the question I was going to ask you before was, what happens inside of people when they hear a story? Just succinctly.
What happens when someone hears a story? I think they relate, and they say, I'm seeing a bit of myself in this story.
Yes.
And what would I have done if I was in that position? And maybe next time I will do better. And maybe next time I will see myself in that story. It's kind of like someone once said, you know why we write? You know why we read? To know that we're not alone. And when we hear a story, we realize we're not alone in the world. There's a universality, the human experience of joy and loss and suffering and pain. We feel we're not alone in the world when we hear a story. And that's why I find stories so comforting.
Eli Rubenstein, thank you so much for being with us. And to all of my listeners and viewers, it's great to be with you once again. And I look forward to being with you next week. Have a beautiful Chanukah. Am Yisrael Chai. There should be peace in Israel and peace around the world. And once again, this show has been dedicated to the IDF, the people of Israel, all peoples who are courageous and brave. Chag Sameach and happy Chanukah. Good night.
Happy Hanukkah. Thank you, Avrum. I'll do better next time.
I hope so.